Welcome to History 201. Our goal in this course is to trace the development of Western civilization from the rise of the Greeks to the end of the Protestant Reformation. It's an enormous span of time. But I think what we've got to do first is to understand what we mean by Western civilization, and then to unpack why we're moving from, say, about 500 BC to round about 1648. Those are the dates which are listed on the course calendar anyway. So what do we mean by Western civilization? Well, Western, right? That one's easy. Well, it should be. But I think we're too used to thinking about that picture of the world that we get from these maps that we see all over the place, these standard Mercator images of the world, which show Europe in the privileged position at the top and then North America off there somewhere in the west. But if you look at a Chinese world map, for instance, you see China in the center, and who's in the east? Well, it's the Americans. Then what that should alert us to begin with is that Western is a completely abstract concept. It makes no sense to talk about a Western sphere on a globe. If you turn then to look at the opening chapters of Spielvogel, what you'll see there is that he talks about the West actually beginning in a part of the world we call the Middle East. He starts his view of Western civilization by looking at North Africa, and by looking at the places that we'd label Mesopotamia, or the Near East. That is, that area between the rivers Euphrates and Tigris. That's modern Iraq. But for Spielvogel, that's where Western civilization begins, in these places we call the Middle East. So, shall we say our notion of what Western is a little fluid. It could mean a whole pile of things. Now, Spielvogel justifies his decision to start in what's modern Iraq, in Mesopotamia, by saying that these Eastern civilizations are those ones which give rise to the structures, the values, the styles of governance that are transported into the West. And so, our notion of what's Western civilization actually begins in the Middle East, according to Spielvogel. So that should alert us to the fact that Western, at least, is a cultural concept. It doesn't really mean anything absolute on a map. But what about civilization? That one should be easy, right? Well, the term itself comes from a Latin word, civitas. That word means city or town. It's the root of our modern English word civic, civilization too. So that should alert us to the fact that at some level what we're doing is tracing the development of human history in terms of large-scale settlements. Large-scale settlements are important because the people who live there need to cooperate at some level. They need to cooperate to manufacture goods, to create food, to distribute resources. So they're characterized right from the beginning by some sort of primitive economy. They also need to protect themselves from outsiders. So they perhaps need some mechanism for protection, maybe some sort of city wall to protect them from outsiders. Perhaps they need to raise an army for defense. Perhaps they need some sort of police force, some force to regulate law and order. And if you're doing all of these sorts of things, you also need somebody in charge. You need some sort of structure, some sort of government. So what this implies is some sort of social hierarchy. So with a leader at the top. But once you have peace, stability, a regular food supply, then the society can also start doing some of these extra things, like developing culture, perhaps building large structures, temples, perhaps creating art, writing, these sorts of things. So civilization has some sort of connection with these large-scale structures and all of the things that go with them. If you turn to Spielvogel, he defines civilization quite early on. He says civilization is a complex culture in which large numbers of human beings share a variety of common elements. Now, that's a useful definition, at least. But there's a problem. Right from the beginning, there's a problem with this definition. What do you do with peoples who don't fit in with that definition? What do you do with people who don't live in large, settled communities? Nomadic peoples. Do we just leave them out of this story? Are they uncivilized? In fact, this idea of being uncivilized is actually a legacy of the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans. As we'll see in a future lecture, they use this term to distinguish themselves from those people who are outside their city walls, outsiders. So when we're talking about Western civilization in this class, we're talking about the development of a very particular style of culture. This is the culture that tends to dominate on the European mainland and then later is transferred to the New World. That's not part of this course. But we also need to keep in mind that when we're talking about Western civilization, we're also leaving certain groups of people out of the story right from the very start. Well, what about the boundaries of this course, the chronological boundaries? Why start in 500 BC or so, and why finish on that very specific date, 1648? It was perhaps easier to justify the latter decision first, because 1648 marks the date in which the Treaty of Westphalia is signed. This marks the end of the 30 Years' War. This is the most violent war in European history up to this point. It's the most violent war in European history up until World War I. The wars fought largely in what's now modern Germany, Austria, Czech Republic, Slovakia, these sorts of regions. But the thing about this war is that it sucks in every major power across Europe, one by one, and then it spits them out, exhausted. And in this way, the 30 Years' War is the first modern war. It's fought between enormous armies for the first time, and it sees widespread use of gunpowder weapons, and it sees enormous civilian casualties as part of a deliberate, conscious strategy by both sides. This painting here is by the painter Peter Bruegel the Elder. It's done actually a bit before the 30 Years' War. It's done in 1562. But the thing that it really conveys quite clearly is the scale of this, of the battles now. We're not looking at a few knights in shining armor riding off and doing glorious deeds. This is a large conscript army, bristling with these pikes as it crosses the earth. This is new. This huge scale of warfare is new. So that means that 1648 might be a very good place for History 202, the next part of this course, to begin. But in many ways, the 30 Years' War marks the end of something very, very important. And that is the end of the use of religion as a potent political force in Europe. The 30 Years' War, what's so important about it is it starts off fundamentally as a dispute between Catholics and Protestants. The Catholic ruler in Bohemia wants to obliterate Protestantism in his lands, wants to eliminate Protestantism forever. But what happens over time, over these 30 years, is that the war completely degenerates. And in the final couple of stages of the war, it's no longer Catholics against Protestants. It's Catholics against Catholics. And why are they fighting each other? Not for religion, but for balance of power. Good secular political reasons. That's different. This religious unity that you'd seen in the Middle Ages, this idea that religion was integral to politics, that we'll see in course after course after course, that breaks down. That breaks down and ends with the 30 Years' War, and that's very new. In fact, you see this at the conference which leads up to the Treaty of Westphalia. As I said, it starts out as a religious war. But the conference which ends the war sees all of the major powers in Europe invited to negotiate peace, with the exception of one, the papacy. The papacy isn't even invited. This war, which starts out as a conflict about religion, ends up without the most important religious figure of the day even invited to participate. So this is brand new. This is different. And this is why it marks a very good place to end this course. After this, if you want to integrate politics and religion, you do it in the New World. Think of the Pilgrim Fathers. They're leaving Europe at exactly this time, religious refugees. So something fundamentally has changed by 1648, so it's a good date to end. But what about beginning? Why choose around about 500 BC to begin? Very fuzzy date. Especially, as I said, the Spielvogel begins with ancient Mesopotamia. We're going to begin with the rise of the ancient Greeks for a few reasons. In the first place, many of the cultures that Spielvogel spends the first couple of chapters describing are pretty much destroyed or obliterated. For strange reasons, we don't really know much about it, but these civilizations which have blossomed in the Mediterranean, around about 1200 BC, suddenly start declining. If you read Egyptian sources, they talk about their territories being attacked by these people they just call the Sea People. We don't know very much about them, but we do know that these people were marauders. They attacked the coastlines, they destroyed civilizations, and what we do know from archaeology is that a period between about 1200 BC and about 800 BC is one of decline. Population declines, it shrinks, settlements shrink as well. But round about 800 BC, we start to see a recovery again. And for that reason, it's a good place to start. But the second reason that I think it's important to start with the Greeks is because Europeans do trace their origins to ancient Greek society. They don't trace their origins to the ancient Mycenaeans or the Phoenicians or any of these other ancient societies that Spielvogel spends the first couple of chapters talking about. As we'll see, Europeans inherit an enormous amount from the ancient Greeks. As you're probably aware, the Greeks give us our sense of democracy. That's the idea that a society should be ruled by the people who live there, the people who have a stake in it. If you have a look at this slide, this is a slide of an ancient Greek temple, but it's also a slide of a very important American political building. Why did these Americans model their political building after an ancient Greek temple? Well, it's about democracy, isn't it? They're saying that their society, their style of government is based upon ideas which were fermented in the ancient Greek world. And so they modeled their political architecture after the architecture of the ancient Greeks. The legacy of the Greeks is much more than just this. The Greeks helped define how we see, how we investigate the natural world. Spielvogel talks about some of the great thinkers of the ancient Greek world, and we'll be talking about many of them as well. People like Hippocrates, Plato, Aristotle. These are massively important figures. The Greeks gave us our tradition of intellectual debate. That's philosophy. And we'll talk about people like Aristotle, about Socrates, figures like that. The legacy of Plato and Aristotle, though, is not just some abstract philosophy that is just popular in the Greek world and then dies out. It's far, far more than that. Because Plato and then Aristotle are used as the basis for Christian theology. We'll see down the road in the 5th century AD, great Christian figure St. Augustine. He's trying to figure out what the Christian message really means. And to do that, what he does is he opens up the writings of the pagan Plato. He uses Plato as a window to try and understand Christian ideas. And so as a result of that, early Christianity is based upon a particular reading of the Bible through the lens of this pagan Plato. In the 13th century, we see the same sort of dynamic play out again. The great Christian philosopher St. Thomas Aquinas tries to understand more about Christian revelation, and to do it, he turns to the works of Aristotle. And he makes Aristotle into the lens for the interpretation of the Bible. So these pagan philosophers have a very important legacy for Christianity. But the Greeks ask other questions which are very, very important to us. Questions that we're still wrestling with today. They ask questions about ethics, things like, is it ever right to rebel against an unjust ruler? Should a member of society have a right to personal vengeance? If you're wronged by somebody, if somebody kills your brother, do you have a right to personal vengeance against them? They ask questions Like, what aspects of a person's character do they get from their parents? What aspects of their character do they get from their interaction with the environment? That's that old nature versus nurture argument. Begins with the Greeks. What should be the correct relationship between the sexes? The Greeks are thinking about that too. And the Greeks love public debate. They love debating all of these issues. And they develop a formal art of correct, proper speaking and arguing in public. This is called rhetoric. We'll talk about the importance of rhetoric again and again over the course of this term. But we could go on. If you look at this slide, this is a city that you might well be familiar with. That very specific grid pattern layout that you've got for this city, that goes back to the Greeks as well. It's a fellow called Hippodamus of Miletus who suggests that cities should be designed on a rectangular grid pattern. And that's back in the 5th century BC. So the people who engineered Charlottetown, sure, they said that they were building upon British traditions of building cities, but that's in the end Greek, going back to good old Hippodamus of Miletus. Most of our standard forms of literature come from the ancient Greeks as well. The Greeks defined the nature of comedy and tragedy, for instance. They gave us our sense of what constitutes proper historical writing. Very important sub-theme for this course. We'll meet Herodotus in a class a couple of days from now. He's the first historian, generally labelled. And the Greeks give us our sense of aesthetics, our sense of what constitutes beauty as well. And of course, it gives us our modern sense of the cult of the athlete, something that we talk about every couple of years with the Olympic Games, which is another Greek idea. So the Greeks are a very important, good place to start. So in the next class, we'll be looking at the rise of ancient Greek society and the writings of Homer and what they can tell us about them.